Hello, my name is Kathleen Nichols, and I'm delighted to welcome you back here to Magdala as we continue our series of Jewish feasts and Christianity. In this segment, we're going to be talking about the Jewish feast of Hanukkah, and that's why I'm here right in front of the Magdala stone. This is one of the most important archaeological finds in Israel because of what most academics see that it represents, with the carvings not only of the menorah that you can see right in the front over what looks like maybe an altar, some amphora here, other symbols on the top pointing, all of them pointing to the Second Temple, found in a synagogue at the same time. So it was here at the same time that the temple existed in Jerusalem. Why is that important? Because it shows the great connection between the Jewish population here in Galilee and Jerusalem, the Jerusalem temple. But it also shows that the synagogue was used as a sacred space for sacred things and not just a meeting place. Now, the other thing that makes this important is this menorah that was found on this stone is the oldest depiction of a menorah found in a synagogue, carved into stone. And so it's actually quite remarkable. And for those of you who have seen symbols of Hanukkah or have gone to different places where you can get Christmas decorations, you'll notice that there's a lot of Hanukkah materials as well, including what looks like a menorah, because it is central to this feast of Hanukkah. So, what did it do when it was in the temple? Well, even according to the stone, it would have been right outside the holiest place in the temple, which is the Holy of Holies, and it would constantly be lit. And the menorah was actually the sign of the perpetual presence of the Lord there. That's why the light was always shining. And the second thing that I just want to point out are these 7 branches. It's important because that's how you can tell a menorah from a Hanukkah, which we'll look at in just a second. These 7 branches, many say, well, they're like the 7 planets or the 7 days of creation. And right in the center would be the Sabbath. Now, the menorah played a key part in what happened at the beginning of the Feast of Hanukkah, or the Feast of Lights. And so let's go over to our Hanukkah and I'll explain it a little bit more. Follow me. So we've made our way here across the lobby where we have our Christmas tree as well as what they call a Hanukkah. And so many people refer to this, even in the newspapers, as the place of Hanukkah Christmas. And it's interesting, this year we actually have Hanukkah and Christmas coinciding. Hanukkah ends, I think, on Christmas Eve, and so they coincide very, very closely. Now, I wanted to explain what we're celebrating for Hanukkah, or what the Jewish people celebrate, and it is a miracle. This stand, this menorah, like I said, it's called a Hanukkah, actually speaks about that miracle. So let's go back to the 2nd century BC. There was the time of Alexander the Great before that, who had conquered this whole area of the world. And then he had different people, of course, that would succeed him as rulers in different areas of his conquered lands. Well, here in this area of the world, a Greek ruler came in whose name was Antiochus IV Epiphanes, or Epiphanes. I want to point that out because it might sound familiar to our ears, the Feast of the Epiphany. Now, the Epiphany, we celebrate it in the Catholic Church when the 3 kings come and Jesus is revealed to them, to the world of the Gentiles, as the Word who became flesh, the Lord, the Messiah. Well, Epiphanes was a name that this Greek ruler put on his real name because he decided to call himself the manifestation of God himself. And so in the 2nd century, what he started to do, Antiochus IV Epiphanes, was to persecute the Jewish people. And so he profaned the temple. And if you know anything about the Jewish faith, the most unclean animal is a swine or a pig. And so what he did is he had pigs sacrificed on the altar. In fact, in the book of Daniel, I think it's chapter 7, he calls this the great abomination, or the desolation of abomination, or the abomination of desolation in Daniel 9. So this was a really big problem. And what was happening during this entire period is you had the Jewish people with their strong beliefs really kind of being so contrasted and in a way sort of sucked into or surrounded by and marinated in a Greek pagan culture. They had many gods, and they certainly didn't recognize the one God of the Jewish people as the true God. So it became really difficult for them to practice their faith. Now you can imagine when you've got people who are zealous for the Lord, it will spark a revolt. And that's exactly what happened to the very famous Maccabees. And so the Maccabean revolt began in the 2nd century. There was a lot of fighting until they were able to conquer the area of Jerusalem and the temple. And they were able to relight the menorah and reconsecrate the temple that this feast day began. In fact, the word Hanukkah actually means dedication or consecration. And so they rededicated the temple and they said, we are going to institute a feast of 8 days of joy for this great miracle that such a small, weak army was able to conquer the people who were part of one of the greatest empires in history, one of the greatest armies following in the footsteps of Alexander the Great. And so that was the miracle of Hanukkah. Now it's important to note that happened, the profanation of the temple, on the 25th of the month of Kislev for the Jewish people in the year 167. It was exactly to the day 3 years later that the Maccabean army the Maccabees were able to rededicate the temple on the 25th day of Kislev. And so that is the great miracle. But the 8 days is important because I wanted to show you on this Hanukkah, or this menorah, candelabra type menorah, or menorah type candelabra, you have more than the 7 branches that we saw on the menorah on the stone. You've got 4 here, and 1 more. So you actually have 8 here at the bottom, and then you have another one, which is the 9th one. So you might ask yourself, why is this? Well, the reason is because they actually instituted this feast that lasts 8 days. And so that's why they have the 8 days of light, because it's when they were able to celebrate this miracle of relighting, reconsecrating, rededicating the temple. Now, in the Babylonian Talmud, which is a book which speaks about different feasts and different teachings and practices of the Jewish people, there's actually a talk of a second miracle that has to do with Hanukkah, and it also has to do with this Hanukkah, or this stand. It's not just the miracle of the conquest of the Maccabees and the rededication of the temple, it's actually the miracle of the oil. And so here we don't put candles, you actually put these containers with oil. So each one of these 8 branches would have oil, and it's only here in the center that you would have a candle. And that candle has a very special name, and it's simply lit to be able to, and then you can light all of the different oil lamps that are here on the menorah. So why oil? Well, the tradition goes like this. When the Maccabees came in and wanted to light the menorah of the temple, they couldn't find enough pure oil to do it with. And so they said, well, let's do it with the oil that we have, even though it seems like it's only enough for 1 day. So they lit the menorah of the temple, symbolizing the presence of the Lord again with his people, which was so important. This light that drove out the pagan false faith and was able to reinstitute the true faith in the one God. Well, when they put the oil here, it didn't last for only 1 day. In fact, the menorah continued bright and shining for 8 full days until they were able to get more oil. And that's why even today, if you have any Jewish friends, or if you're here in Israel, you'll be able to find all of these really delicious foods that are made with oil. This is the time of year when they have especially deep fried jelly donuts, which are just fantastic. And you can also find in especially Ashkenazi Jewish circles deep fried potato pancakes, just delicious. And so they really enjoy this type of food this time of year because this was the miracle of the oil. Another tradition that you may know is the playing of the dreidel, or the driddle. It's this little top that you spin, and each one of the sides of that spinning top has a letter of the Jewish alphabet. Those are the letters Nun, Gimel, He, and Shin. It's a Hebrew acronym for this phrase, a great miracle happened there. And if you're here in Jerusalem, or even in this land of the Holy Land, they'll say a great miracle happened here, referring to the miracle of the conquest and rededication, and also the miracle of the lighting of the lamps. Another thing I wanted to point out is this Hanukkah. I had mentioned there's a candle here, and that candle is actually referred to as the deacon, or the servant candle. The servant, which is used to light the entire thing. The Hebrew word for that is shamash, so the servant. And most of the time, the Jewish people are told to put the Hanukkah in their windows or by their doors so that people around can see the light shining, because they want to give testimony to the great miracle of the rededication of the temple. With all of this in mind, let's talk a little bit about how this, or reflecting on this, helps us to understand our Christian faith better, going back to the sources of Jewish feasts. So, We talked about the reconquering of the temple. Again, the small army that was able to overcome this bigger army. And if we think about at times how difficult things can be, and we think, does it really, are things really going to change in the world? Are things really going to get better? Look what happened in history, and in many places and times in history. So this is one of the things that it helps us to remember. Our little light of faith actually just breaks through the darkness. And so secondly, light returns. When they put the menorah back in the temple, the Lord, his presence was among us again. But remember, what happens during our Christmas time is the light has come into the world. In fact, in our creed we say, God from God, light from light. And during the season where the days are constantly getting shorter, and in the shortest day of the year, very close to Christmas time, the light is breaking in, showing us that we do have hope. The light overcomes the darkness, not just of paganism like in the time of the Maccabees, but the light overcomes the darkness of sin, of confusion, of so much hurt and pain, a lack of hope. This is why the season is so important. In fact, the great Jewish historian Flavius Josephus, when he wrote about this feast, actually referred to it as, in his history of the Jewish people, he called it the festival of lights. He didn't use the word Hanukkah. Hanukkah doesn't even appear in the Bible, but he calls this the Feast of Lights, or the Festival of Lights. And this goes back, he says, Josephus, the historian says, it goes back to the right to worship. The Jewish people were not able to worship in the temple. They were persecuted by King Antiochus, as I said. And so now they're given the right to worship, which gives them hope in times of crisis. Now, the reason why I think this is important in the time of Josephus as well is because he lived in the time of the Roman conquest of this area of the world, of the Holy Land. And so they didn't have Jewish persecution as such, but they were very oppressed. And so, of course, he's going to point this out. And it became a very important feast. Jesus also lived in the time that the Jewish people were under the Romans and under Roman oppression. And so it's very interesting. We can ask ourselves, well, did Jesus live Hanukkah? If we look at the book of John, the Gospel of John, chapter 10, we actually see that he did. He lived the feast of dedication. And it says very clearly, if you read John 10, verse 22, and the verses around it, it's wintertime. Jesus is inside the temple, in fact, actually in Solomon's portico. And so John is trying to give us a very clear message. Not only, even if it was a minor feast, not only did Jesus underline the importance of it by going to the temple, even though it wasn't a specific pilgrimage feast like some of the others we've talked about, he is in the portico, the doorway, because true philosophers for the Greeks, they taught in porticos or in doorways. And so Jesus is bringing the truth as he's in Solomon's portico at the time of this feast. And just before this, actually, many chapters before this, John tells us that Jesus purified the temple. He rededicated, in a sense, the temple by throwing out all of the money changers and all the people that were trading and cheating people. And so he was making the temple clean. And why was that? Because it says in the gospel, zeal for his father's house consumed him. The same words that are used to describe the zeal of the Maccabees when they fought for the right to worship and fought to retake the temple. And so it's very interesting how the Lord is underlining this part of who he is as the new temple and as the light of the world. He's looking for this inner purification in our own temples when he calls, Paul calls us, we are the temple of the Lord. So we know that he is actually the true Epiphany, the Lord among us. But let's take one more step back. When we're talking about this candle, this deacon candle or this servant candle, we know that Jesus was the true shamash, the true servant. He called himself that. I am the servant. In fact, we can even go back to Psalm 18:27, where it says, you, Lord, are the light of the world. You illumine the darkness. And so as the servant, he lights all of the candles. In fact, it's neat that when you look at the Sermon on the Mount, he actually says to us, you are the light of the world. And he comes to light each and every one of us up so that we can shine, not under a barrel, but on a mountaintop, so we can break through the darkness. In fact, we can break through the crises with this light of faith that we have inside. And I think about probably one of the biggest times of crisis for the Christians was when they were first beginning. And Jesus had been crucified. You think about those poor two souls that walked the road to Emmaus. They were in crisis, time of great darkness. Jesus walks alongside of them and just inflames their hearts. And that is the true sense of this festival of lights and what Jesus really is. When he gave the blind man his sight in the temple, that was John chapter 9, okay? It was in chapter 10 that John tells us that Jesus was celebrating the Feast of the Dedication. And so he's bringing these things together so that he can point out that the true light of the world, this true presence of the Lord among us, is Jesus himself. Now, for those of you who know and pray the Liturgy of the Hours, there's also something I want to point out, and that is the prayer that we pray every single day in Compline. And that is the prayer, the words of Simeon. When Mary and Joseph presented Jesus in the temple as a child, remember that just like we want to do during Christmas time, he took this baby in his arms and he gave a beautiful prayer to the Lord. He says, "Now, Lord, you may let your servant go in peace, for my eyes have seen the salvation," something that he had been praying for. And then he says, "A light to reveal to the nations and the glory of your people Israel." He looks at this child and identifies him as the light. And so, of course, this Feast of Lights speaks to us very deeply as Christians. So, as we're mesmerized by the lights of a Christmas tree or the flames of candles or oil lamps during the season of darkness, just because of the time of year, let's remember not only the Jewish feasts, but also the fulfillment of those feasts in Christ the Lord. We are called to embrace the humanity of Christ like Simeon did. The light and the hope in the darkness of this world, in this world of crisis. And let us then celebrate the true Epiphany and the true light that has come to us through the anointed, the oil, right? The anointing, who is the Messiah himself. Well, God bless you, and I hope you can join us for the next segment of our Crossroads series of Jewish feasts and Christianity. We're praying for you from Magdala.